The moment Congresswoman Riley Monroe stepped into Judge Clarence Redgrave's courtroom, the tension in the air could slice through concrete. Every camera lens twitched. Every legal mind in the room sharpened its focus. Because what happened next wouldn't just make headlines. It would redefine courtroom history. Judge Redgrave, a 70-year-old titan of the federal bench, sat high in his leather chair. Black robes draped like armor, with silver hair swept back like an old king at war. He narrowed his eyes at the 33-year-old woman standing before him and allowed himself a slow, condescending smile. "Well, well, well, Congresswoman Monroe," he said, his voice drenched in arrogance. "So good to have someone from the Hill. Come down here to explain the law to us. How refreshing." The gallery fell silent. The attorneys froze mid-breath. The court reporter paused her fingers. Riley Monroe didn't blink. Her maroon blazer caught the courtroom lights. Her afro haloed with power. And her brown eyes, they burned. Because what Judge Redgrave didn't know was that she hadn't come for a photo op. She came for war. And she had brought a full arsenal of facts, law, and intent. This wasn't just any civil rights lawsuit. This was the showdown between tradition and truth, between a man who thought the courtroom belonged to him and a woman who had spent her life fighting for those the system forgot. To understand what was about to unfold, you had to understand the battlefield. Judge Clarence Redgrave was a relic wrapped in robes, appointed during a Republican administration decades ago. He was known as the Iron Gavel, the man who silenced civil rights attorneys with a raised brow, the man who dismissed entire cases with a sigh and a stamp. His courtroom was lined with oil paintings of legal giants, all white, all male, all symbols of a system that never saw Monroe coming. He believed the courtroom was his cathedral, his voice, the gospel, his word, the law. But today, that temple was about to tremble. Riley Monroe wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a former public defender from St. Louis. Raised on concrete and courage, she clawed her way through law school, built a practice in Dallas, and earned her seat in Congress by flipping a district no one thought possible. She knew the law better than most who wore the robe. She knew Redgrave's rulings, his language, his record. She had studied him the way a prizefighter studies tape before the bout. And now she was standing in his ring, unafraid. The case was a voting rights lawsuit. On the surface, routine. But the documents Monroe had filed contained proof of systemic voter suppression. Real evidence. Not speculation. Footage. Statistics. First-hand testimony. The kind of case that would normally get swept away by a shrug from a judge like Redgrave. But not this time. Not with Monroe standing at the plaintiff's table. And not with the nation watching. She began her opening statement. "Your Honor," she said. "Calm. Measured. The evidence will show that over 50,000 voters in Texas were denied access to the ballot, in direct violation of the Constitution." Judge Redgrave reclined in his chair, face unreadable, until he spoke again. "Congresswoman Monroe," he said, deliberately mispronouncing her name. "I do hope you have more than politics and cell phone footage to support such a claim." The first punch thrown, and the crowd held its breath. Monroe inhaled slowly. And then, the battle began. The signs were subtle at first, but to a trained eye, they were clear as sirens. Judge Redgrave started calling her Monroe, then Monroe, then Monray. Each time slightly off, each time a little louder. A game of microaggressions wrapped in legal decorum. She corrected him once. He smirked and never corrected himself. Then came the interruptions. Defense attorneys were allowed to cut Monroe off mid-sentence. They spoke over her, objected out of turn. Redgrave let it slide. But when Monroe tried to respond, he slammed her down with a single word. Sustained. She quoted recent precedent. He rolled his eyes. She laid out statistical proof. He labeled it speculative. When she held up documented closures of polling places in black neighborhoods, he asked if it was relevant. Your Honor, Monroe said. Firm. Composed. We have video footage from 3 polling locations, showing registered voters being turned away. She held up a tablet. Click. A still image of a poll worker shutting a door in someone's face. Objection. Defense barked. Prejudicial and inflammatory. Sustained. Redgrave didn't even glance at the screen. Move on. Monroe's jaw clenched. Your Honor, this footage. I said move on. He cut her off. His voice raised just enough to silence the gallery. Unless you have something more substantial than amateur videos. This court is not interested. The reporters shifted in their seats. Legal observers whispered to each other. Even the defense team blinked in surprise. This wasn't skepticism. This was dismissal. But Monroe, she didn't back down. Your Honor, she said again, her voice now cutting through the chamber like steel. This video is central to the case. It shows constitutional violations, happening in real time. And then it happened. The moment that would define his fall. Judge Redgrave laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a smirk. A full, belly-deep, condescending laugh that echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom, like the sound of a career cracking. Congresswoman, he said between chuckles, I've sat on this bench longer than you've been in public life. Cell phone videos and political theater may impress your colleagues in Congress, but this is a court of law. Real law. Not whatever passes for it in political science classes these days. Silence. Heavy. Final. Monroe stood still. Motionless. Hands on the plaintiff's table. Her gaze locked on the man who had just publicly mocked her evidence. Mocked the rights of 50,000 citizens. Mocked the very institution he claimed to serve. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The fire was still there, but it had been refined, forged into a blade. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to approach the bench. Denied. Redgrave waved her off with a flick of his hand. Let's move on to your next political speech. But Monroe didn't move. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Thick. Marked. Waiting. Before we proceed, she said, there are procedural matters this court needs to address. The room shifted. Slightly. Like everyone could feel the ground tilt. Redgrave's smirk faded just a shade. What matters? He asked, his voice catching on its edge. She opened the folder. The sound of paper rustling was louder than his gavel had ever been. Your Honor, she said, we need to talk about your rulings. In civil rights cases over the past 5 years, every head in the courtroom snapped up. The gallery leaned forward. Even the stenographer froze. Judge Redgrave's face turned a shade darker. Excuse me, he said. But Monroe was already reading. Before coming here today, Monroe said, I took the liberty of reviewing your judicial history. All of it. Her tone was surgical. Not loud. Not angry. Just devastatingly precise. And what I found was fascinating. That word, fascinating, hung in the courtroom like a warning shot. Redgrave gripped the bench, knuckles whitening. Congresswoman, you are out of order. Actually, Monroe replied, calmly, I don't believe I am. She pulled out the first document. Morrison v. Texas Secretary of State. A 2023 case. Voting rights. dismissed on procedural grounds. According to you? But according to this transcript, she lifted the paper slightly. You told the plaintiff's attorney, and I quote, maybe stick to personal injury law and leave constitutional cases to professionals. Gasps. The gallery reacted like they'd been struck. Even the defense shifted uneasily. That case was dismissed legally. Redgrave barked. Monroe didn't flinch. Was it? She said. Because it was later appealed and overturned. Next, Henderson v. Texas Board of Elections. 2022. Dismissed again. But this time you went further. You sanctioned the civil rights attorneys for filing what you called a frivolous lawsuit. Monroe raised another file. Those sanctions, she said, were also overturned by the Fifth Circuit. Who described your conduct as inappropriate and potentially biased? Still no apology. Still no retraction. The defense attorney muttered something under breath. The judge said nothing. Should I continue? Monroe asked, her voice steady, her eyes locked. Because I have documentation of 12 more cases where your pattern repeated itself. She didn't wait. She opened the next folder. Williams v. Texas Department of Public Safety. Dismissed with prejudice. You called the evidence political theater. Reversed on appeal. Jackson versus Harris County. You told the attorney. Stop wasting the court's time with conspiracy theories. Also reversed. Thompson v. Texas Legislature. Dismissed after you told the plaintiffs. Find a better hobby than suing the state. That one resulted in a formal reprimand from the Judicial Conduct Board, with each name, each folder, each court seal. Redgrave's posture slumped further. The man who once ruled his courtroom like a throne was now cornered by documentation, by legal history, by his own words. And Monroe, she hadn't raised her voice once. Then came the final blow. And then, Your Honor, she said, we come to Davis v. Texas Attorney General. 2021. Do you remember that one? Redgrave's voice was barely audible. That case was filed by a coalition of civil rights organizations. Monroe continued. And during that trial, you made several statements that, well, let's just say they didn't age well. She pulled out a final document. Stump it. Signed. Transcribed. Here's what you said. She paused, held the transcript aloft. And read. These people need to stop complaining about every little rule and learn to follow the law, like everyone else. The courtroom shook. Reporters started typing frantically. Gallery members shifted with discomfort. Even the stenographer looked up. These people, Monroe repeated, everyone in this room knows what that means. She lowered the paper and raised her eyes. But here's the part that matters most. That case was also overturned. And the appellate court, they didn't just reverse your ruling. They referred your conduct to the Judicial Conduct and Disability Committee for investigation. Redgrave looked like he had seen a ghost. That investigation was inconclusive. He whispered. Yes, Monroe said, because investigations into sitting federal judges take time, but I imagine, if new evidence of a pattern were to emerge, like, say, 12 separate cases across 5 years, that investigation might just reopen itself. She motioned toward the towering stack of documents. New evidence, like laughing off constitutional violations in open court. New evidence, like shutting down voting rights claims without review. New evidence, like a trail of dismissals so transparent that even a first-year law student could follow it. And just like that, the courtroom stopped breathing. Judge Clarence Redgrave had gone pale, shaken, And for the first time in 2 decades, he was no longer in control of his courtroom. "Your Honor," Monroe said, her voice calm, measured, but echoing like a drumbeat in a funeral march. "I move that this court recuse itself from this case, on the grounds of demonstrated bias and prejudicial conduct." The words didn't explode. They carved through the room, leaving silence in their path. "I further move," Monroe continued, "that this case be transferred to a judge capable of evaluating the evidence, without the burden of a documented history of suppressing civil rights claims." She paused. Let the moment sink in. "And finally, Your Honor, I respectfully suggest you consider whether continuing to preside over voting rights cases is in the best interest of justice, given the overwhelming pattern I've just laid before this court." Silence. Then chaos. Reporters rushed to exits. Phones lit up. Court officers whispered in corners. The defense team, for the first time that morning, looked genuinely afraid. Judge Redgrave said nothing. He couldn't, because for the first time in decades, he didn't have the floor. Monroe gathered her documents. Carefully, gracefully. Her briefcase clicked shut like a gavel in reverse. And still, Redgrave sat there, silent, ashen, frozen, until finally, in a voice cracked by realization, he said, Court is in recess. We will reconvene tomorrow." His gavel fell, not like a hammer, but like a whisper, a soft, ineffectual sound. But outside, the gavel dropped hard. Within 20 minutes, video clips from the courtroom hit social media. Monroe holding up transcripts. Monroe reading damning quotes. Monroe dropping the 12-case folder on the table like a royal flush. Monroe meltdown. Judge bias exposed. Riley vs. Redgrave. They all trended. TikTokers added slow-mo edits to her quotes. Twitter erupted in legal commentary. Harvard law professor Dana Alston tweeted, "What Riley Monroe just did was surgical." She didn't argue. She dismantled. Systemic bias in the judiciary just got a face. Fox News legal commentator Brian Callister, no friend to Monroe's politics, admitted, "That was not theater. That was case law. That was facts. And she brought it. All of it." Redgrave's defenders, mostly silent. The next morning, Judge Redgrave did not appear in court. His clerk read a brief statement. "Due to health concerns, Judge Redgrave is taking indefinite medical leave. This case will be reassigned to Judge Alicia Freeman." Health concerns fooled no one. It was the oldest retreat in the federal judiciary, but this time, no one was buying it. The Judicial Conduct and Disability Committee announced that same afternoon that they would reopen the 2021 investigation based on new evidence. 3 civil rights cases Monroe had referenced filed motions to reopen on grounds of judicial misconduct. The Department of Justice quietly began reviewing. A decade of civil rights rulings from Redgrave's bench. Law schools scheduled Monroe for guest lectures. Legal watchdogs praised her as a symbol of what legal scholarship and courage could achieve. She was invited to speak before the Bar Association, CNN, MSNBC, even conservative outlets couldn't deny the moment had shifted. Riley Monroe had done what no one thought possible. She held a federal judge accountable with nothing but paper, voice, and undeniable truth. With Judge Freeman now presiding, everything changed. The very same evidence Redgrave dismissed was entered into the record. The video footage, the statistical models, the affidavits, all of it. Admitted, reviewed, validated. The civil rights case Monroe had brought forward, no longer dismissed as political theater, was now the center of a federal voting rights lawsuit. The result, a multi-million-dollar settlement, sweeping electoral reforms, polling access restored in over 24 counties. But even bigger than the win was the wake it left behind. Within months, the Judicial Conference announced new mandatory training on bias in civil rights cases. The American Bar Association updated its guidelines for reporting judicial misconduct. Law schools across the country began teaching Monroe's approach to judicial accountability. They called it the Monroe Method. 6 months later, Judge Clarence Redgrave quietly announced retirement. He cited a desire to spend more time with family, but everyone knew he had been retired by truth. His replacement, a former civil rights attorney who had spent her career fighting the very kind of bias Redgrave embodied. The legal world didn't forget. It documented, it archived, it evolved. But Monroe, she stayed focused. In every interview, every panel, she said the same thing. This wasn't about one judge. This was about a system built to protect itself and those it served least. "We don't need courtroom drama," she said once. "We need courtroom reform." She pushed legislation for transparent reporting, BS training, and easier mechanisms to remove judges who violated their oaths. She didn't just win in court. She rewrote the stakes, the case files, the transcripts, the motion to recuse. They now sit in the National Archives, available for law students, journalists, activists, and anyone who wants to know how justice finally stared down a system that mocked it. But the real legacy, it lives in the warning Monroe delivered that day. To every judge, every official, every person in power who believes they are untouchable. Someone is always watching. Someone is always documenting. And someone, like Riley Monroe, is preparing to hold them accountable. The day a 33-year-old black congresswoman walked into a federal courtroom and dismantled a legacy of judicial abuse with nothing but paper, grit, and the Constitution, became a landmark in American jurisprudence. Because justice delayed is not always justice denied, as long as someone is willing to fight for it. And that day, Riley Monroe fought, and justice won.